All right, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone. This is the first of a series of online webinars by Altacy, and we're joined by Dr. Chris Lowe of Long Beach State, and he's going to be talking about sharks. And Chris, take it away.
Sure. So I always love talking about sharks. That's never a problem for me. But what I want to talk about today is how much the field has changed and why the field has changed. So it used to be, dolphins were the big draw to pull students into marine biology. Everybody wanted to study dolphins and whales. And now sharks are kind of the new dolphins and whales. But what's made the field really change has been the evolution of new technology. So what I'm really going to focus on today is the changing role of technology and how we study sharks, and how literally in the last 10 to 15 years, the field has opened up and blossomed. So the bottom line is, this is kind of what people think of when we talk about sharks, right? This is the quintessential, Discovery Channel iconic species. This is the white shark, right? And many of you are probably looking at this picture and developing all these questions, right? So where do they eat? And are they territorial? How fast do they swim? Are they dangerous to people? How deep do they go? Do they get cancer? How often do they eat? Where do they give birth? So all these questions are great questions. And despite the fact that biologists have been studying sharks for over 100 years, probably even longer than that, believe it or not, we haven't answered many of these questions. And the simple reason is sharks are hard to study. So the bottom line is, the reason why they're hard to study is really simple. Some get really large. So a good example of that are whale sharks. You're talking about animals that get 30 feet long plus, the size of a school bus. So obviously you can't keep that in a little tank in a lab and expose it to different treatments to measure some of those things that I was just talking about, some of those questions, right? Some species are actually quite small. As full-grown mature adults, they're only 8 inches long. So this makes them also very difficult to study, mainly because even though you might be able to keep them in a tank, you might not be able to attach various types of spy technology that we use to study their behavior and look at their ecology in the field. In addition, some sharks, many sharks, are highly migratory. They may travel thousands of kilometers in a single season, migrating from one part of a coastline all the way down to another. So that range that they exhibit make them also very difficult to study. So a good example of that are blacktips that migrate along the eastern seaboard, ranging all the way from New England all the way down to Florida in the Gulf of Mexico. So these species show this annual migration every year, traveling thousands of kilometers. We have some species that live really deep or make dives down to 3,000 meters. So a great example of that is a Greenland shark that's estimated to be sometimes maybe 470 years old, one of the oldest living vertebrates on the planet. So here's a species that lives in very, very deep water. It's very cold, it's very high pressure. And that might be actually one of the key to their longevity, is that they live in very cold water. So that makes them difficult to study. In addition, we have species that are just hard to keep. So Greenland shark would be an example. Another classic example are white sharks. White sharks have been notoriously very difficult to be kept in captivity. And that's usually where biologists get to do a lot of experimentation, where we can answer some of those really tough questions about what make these animals tick. However, even in a laboratory setting, you can't really get at understanding how these animals interact with their environment or with other animals. In addition, some species just occur at such low numbers and at such low abundance that they're really hard to find. So even if you wanted to have an experimental setup in a lab where you could try to measure some of those things, or you even had the technology to answer the questions, simply finding these individuals is too challenging. So a good example of that is the cookie cutter shark. Every 10-year-old kid knows what a cookie cutter shark is. And biologists salivate over this species because it's an amazing shark. And we know virtually nothing about it. So all of these questions and all of these challenges in studying sharks have been plaguing biologists for decades. And the bottom line is, what we're really trying to figure out, especially when it comes to shark behavior, is how do they make decisions? So when we look at how people make decisions, we take information that we get from the environment, from all around us, and we use that to make decisions on what we're going to do, where we're going to go, how much time we're going to spend, when we're hungry, when we're thirsty. So we're using all this information that our body's acquiring and our senses are acquiring. And then we're using that to make decisions on what is the best thing for us to do. Sometimes we don't always make the best decisions, but nonetheless, this is how animals are behaving. It's based on information that they're getting from their environment. So if we had spy technology that enabled us to go out and spy on these animals, then we might be able to get context, what's happening around them. We have to be able to monitor what's happening around them, and then ask, why are they going right? Why are they going left? Why are they leaving the area? Why are they staying? So historically, the way we studied shark behavior was really tough. I mean, biologists would go out and either plunk themselves down and throw some chum out and see if they could lure some sharks nearby, and then just watch what they do. And it wasn't until the advent of scuba in the 50s that scientists actually started getting in the water and trying to study shark behavior in the water. And one of my predecessors, Don Nelson, who was actually the founder of the Cal State Long Beach Shark Lab, wanted to understand why these reef sharks occasionally bit divers. So to do this, he built an underwater wet submersible. He'd climb inside that sub with a scuba tank, and then he would chase sharks around to try to get them to elicit what we call an agonistic display. It's this behavior where the sharks would arch their back and drop their petrofins and go into this really exaggerated swimming. If you continue to pursue, the sharks would turn around and come in and bite the sub. So obviously, this was a great tool for studying this particular behavior in the sharks, but you could only stay down for an hour. The sub would lose power. Sometimes it would sink to the bottom. So there wasn't the most safe thing to do, but it was a technology that was available at the time that enabled him to look at an aspect of behavior that we couldn't have studied any other way. So, but all the while, he recognized that just using direct observation is still too limiting. It doesn't give us enough information about context, what the sharks are experiencing in the environment at night when we can't see. So the other thing that we've learned in California in particular is that many shark species have gone through ups and downs, and white sharks are a classic example. So probably by the early 1900s, white shark populations were probably depressed in the Northeast Pacific, largely due to the fact that sometimes the babies were being caught and killed in fisheries, but mainly because their main food source, marine mammals, were hunted, many of them were hunted to the verge of extinction by the early 1900s. So on this graph, you can see that white shark populations were probably fairly low, marine mammal populations were low until the 1970s when marine mammals were protected. And then we can see marine mammals, and I'm using California sea lion as an example here, their populations start to go up because they're no longer being killed, and commercial fisheries are just being killed because they were viewed as competitor. Now, if it's an important food source for adult white sharks, and white shark populations are being protected in the mid-1990s in California, what we see is prey populations go up first, and then a predator population can start to come back because there's adequate food. Now, young white sharks like to eat stingrays, and we see that stingray population's been quite high, but has grown considerably because all the predators were removed. So we can see these relationships between predator and prey, and for a species, an iconic species like white sharks, to see them recover in a place like California and Australia and many of the places where they occur is really a testament to conservation. Okay, so what do we know about white sharks? Well, 25 years ago, if you had asked any biologist what kind of shark we thought a white shark was, we would have said it's a coastal shark. And if you asked how we knew that, biologists would say, well, in the fall months between November and February, it would be not uncommon to see adult white sharks along the Central California area up around the Farallon Islands and Nino or around Guadalupe Island. And of course, what's luring white sharks into these areas are these prey items. So now it's off the Point Conception and Channel Islands. But it's really this food. It's the northern elephant seals, which haul out, come here to give birth to their pups. White sharks like intercepting the pregnant females. They're a good, rich energy source, and getting the naive pups when they leave the beach. So this is what was drawing these animals to these locations. 25 years ago, we didn't really know where they went. We never saw where they went after the winter. We assumed they stuck around, but they were highly mobile. It wasn't until the development of satellite telemetry, which I'm going to talk more about, that my colleagues up at Stanford and Monterey Bay Aquarium started putting satellite tags on these sharks at these aggregation sites off the Farallones and Nino and off Guadalupe Island. And they found in the winter, when the elephant seals left, these sharks would migrate out to the middle of the Pacific, halfway between Baja and Hawaii. And males would spend about 8 months out there, females about 1.5 years, before returning back to one of these feeding aggregation sites, or some females would come back in the spring to give birth to their young. So the other thing that we've learned is that Southern California, that area from Point Conception down to mid-Baja, is an important nursery for white sharks. So white sharks, mako sharks, blue sharks, salmon sharks, thresher sharks all use Southern California as a nursery for their babies, primarily because this habitat becomes incredibly productive in the spring and summer months. So here you can see a baby white shark swimming just along a beach. And of course, in Southern California, where we have thousands of people using our beaches all summer long during the peak of nursery season, this can create a bit of concern. So what we've been trying to figure out are, why are those babies here? Why do they use these beach habitats? How much time do they spend there? Are they feeding there? Are they growing? How fast are they growing? Are they hanging around people? Should we be concerned? So we are going to use some of this new technology to try to answer some of these questions that I posited before. So some of the tools we use have been around for a while. Some are called satellite tags, and there are two types we use. One are called spot tags. Now, a spot tag gets bolted to the shark's dorsal fin, and every time the tag breaks the surface, it is a radio transmitter that sends radio signals to satellites in orbit. So this only can transmit it when the transmitter's in the air, because radio signals cannot penetrate through seawater. So when the shark goes underwater, it stops. When it pops back up, sends those signals out to the satellite, and the satellites are able to triangulate a position and give a latitude and longitude. So every time the tag pops up, I will get an email from the satellite service saying shark number 205 popped up at this latitude, longitude, time, and date. But remember, the minute the tag goes underwater, it turns off. So sharks are not like marine mammals. They don't have to come to the surface to breathe. So we needed some other technology that would help us track them, especially if they weren't at the surface. So the other type of satellite transmitter we use are called pop-off archiving satellite transmitters. Now these transmitters have a light sensor, a temperature sensor, and a depth sensor. They get darted into the shark's back and kind of hang off like an earring. And they have a little mini computer that's recording temperature, light, and depth every 10 to 30 seconds. After a pre-described date, the transmitter will pop off the shark, float up to the surface, upload all the data to the satellite, and then the satellites turn around and download it all to my office. So using these combinations of technology, we can figure out where the sharks are moving. We know the temperature and the water depth that sharks move through, so that we can kind of track their movements. But unfortunately, none of those technologies, other than the spot tag, will give us a really accurate position where the shark is when it's underwater. So the other technology we use are called acoustic transmitters. So acoustic transmitters are now using lower frequency sound waves, which travel really well through seawater, but they have to be received by something. So if we can catch the shark, we can surgically implant, we flip the shark upside down, we can do surgery, we can implant an acoustic transmitter into that shark's body cavity, stitch that shark back up. Now these transmitters have a unique ID code, and anytime a shark swims within about 300 yards of one of our underwater acoustic receivers, the receiver will log the time, the date, and the ID number. So we have these all along our beaches, about 100 yards off the beach, and they're constantly listening for tagged sharks. So we can detect them as they move along these beaches. Another type of technology we use are called smart tags. And these, think of these like Fitbits, and I'll talk more about these later, but you have to catch a shark. We clamp this on the dorsal fin like a little backpack, and I'll tell you about what smart tags do. So these combinations of technologies enable us to not only figure out how far-ranging these sharks can be, what temperature and water depths they prefer to be in, or how close they get to the beach, or how much time they spend there. So in order to get many of these technologies on or in these sharks, we either have to capture them or get them from someone. So occasionally, some of the commercial fishermen that are fishing outside 3 miles offshore will occasionally catch baby white sharks in their nets. They'll call us up, we'll go down, we'll meet the fishermen at the dock. They'll have the shark in a live well. We can measure the shark, take weight, take measurements. We can take fin clips for genetics. We can take a blood sample. We can fit the shark with a variety of different transmitters, take that shark out, release it, and see where it goes. Now, for sharks that are under 5 feet, and are close to the beach, sometimes fishermen aren't allowed to fish that close, we can either use drones or helicopters to spot for us, and we can put a piece of net right in front of the shark as it's swimming along. When the shark gets entangled, we can quickly take the shark out of the net and then process it just like we would if we got it from a commercial fisherman. But for sharks that are bigger than 9 or 10 feet, they're a little bit too big to handle alongside the boat. Those sharks, we can actually drive alongside them with a boat or a jet ski and dart a tag in their back from the surface. But probably the favorite way my students like to tag are using this method. So we work very closely with lifeguards all throughout Southern California. Here you're going to see a video. My grad students on the back of a jet ski tow board. We have a drone telling us where the shark is. They drop in the water and we can quickly dart a transmitter into the shark's back. So by doing this, we can tag a half dozen sharks in an hour. And he is standing right now. So it shows you how shallow or how close to shore these sharks actually are. And based on this technique, we've also figured out that these sharks form these little aggregations and they'll hang out in these areas for periods of up to 50 or 60 days at a time. So once the sharks are tagged, using various types of technology, we can use that technology to answer different types of questions. So for example, here is an animation I'm going to show you of a shark that we caught in 2007 off Ventura. It's a baby, it's 5 feet long. You're going to see a gray smudge up here, and then the water is going to change color. The redder the color, the warmer the water. The bluer the color, the colder, and then there's a date here. So what you'll see is during the summer, this little white shark, it's somewhere in the middle of that black smudge, is moving along Southern California beaches until about October. See this green bluish water coming in? That means the water is getting colder. And as soon as the water starts to get colder, this was a cue that drove these sharks to migrate south to Baja. Now, pretty much every shark that we tag during these summer months or early fall months, when water temperatures dip below 60 degrees, all these sharks exhibited this migration. And then in February, the tag popped off, floated to the surface, so we could recover all this information. So basically what we found was in the winter, when water temperatures dipped below 60 degrees, it was too cold for them in Southern California. And that initiated this southern migration. But we also had an opportunity to do a really cool experiment. So in 2008, we had a shark that was caught off Ventura, taken up to Monterey Bay Aquarium, and kept in Monterey Bay Aquarium on exhibit for 5 months. That shark gained 100 pounds in 5 months. It was the best fed vertebrate in probably all of the US. And they released it in Monterey in February. So as you can see, the water's pretty blue up there. That means the water's cold. And again, what you're going to see is that these sharks can survive cold water. They don't like cold water. In fact, that shark had to come all the way down to Mazatlan to warm up. Now what you're going to see is in April, we get this slug of warm water coming up from the equator that's driving the shark up into the Gulf of California. And then right before the tag was programmed to pop off, that shark was hanging around at a depth of about 150 feet, where the water temperature was about 70 degrees. So what this experiment told us was these young white sharks don't like water too cold, below 60 degrees, and they don't like it too warm, above 84 degrees. So somewhere in the middle is really their sweet spot. So how do we detect sharks moving along beaches? So this is where we use our acoustic receivers and our acoustic tags that we either dart into the outside of the sharks or surgically implant into the sharks. So all these dots that you see are locations where we have acoustic receivers all along beaches in Southern California, around the Channel Islands and around Catalina Island. Now, the technology that we're using to track these sharks can also be used by my colleagues to tag whatever animals they're tagging, fish and turtles and all sorts of animals. And if one of their tagged sharks swims by one of my receivers, I can detect their animals. And if one of my sharks swims by one of their receivers, they can detect my sharks. So we have a very large collaboration along the West Coast from Monterey all the way down to Baja. So we've had sharks detected that we've tagged in Southern California, off Southern California beaches, detected all the way up off Santa Cruz and all the way down to Vizcaino Bay and around Guadalupe Island. So by collaborating with all these other researchers, we can share information. We can learn a lot more about how far our animals may travel. So the other thing that we learned using this technology, and this was really interesting because in 2015, we had a very strong El Nino. In fact, it was one of the strongest on record. And during that summer, our waters were teeming with juvenile white sharks. And now I'm going to show you an animation. You're going to see flashes at these little locations where our receivers are. Every time you see a flash is a detection of a white shark. And then up here is a date and time counter. So each one of these flashes indicates a detection. So what you'll see is in June, July, sharks are being detected all summer long, which is normal, until we get to October, November, December, January. This is only going to run to January, but basically what happened was in the winter, our water temperatures never dipped below 65 degrees. So as a result, there was no cue for these sharks to leave, and they didn't. Pretty much every single shark that we tagged during the summer of 2015 remained resident throughout Southern California all throughout the winter until the next spring when the next batch of babies started showing up. So what this also told us was that strong ENSO events, El Nino-like events, can change the migratory pattern of these sharks and keep them in Southern California all year long. So one of the other things we've learned based on this, and our historic fishing data tells us the same thing, is that there are hotspot locations in Southern California where these young white sharks use as nurseries. So for example, all the bubbles that you see are receiver locations where we've detected juvenile white sharks. So you can see that this whole Santa Monica Bay area is a white shark nursery. This area from Belmont Shore down to Huntington Beach is a historic white shark nursery. From Dana Point down to San Clemente, and also northern San Diego. So all these locations we now know, and Santa Barbara and Ventura, are all known white shark nursery habitats. Now what's really interesting, these areas are very large, 35, 50 mile stretches of beach. From any given summer to the next, sharks will shift from one location to the next, and we don't know why they do that. So these are all our hotspot known areas. So one of the questions we want to try to figure out is what makes a hotspot beach a hotspot? So to do that, we need to develop new technology that enables us to track sharks while they're at a hotspot in order to figure out why are they there. So to do this, we're using robotics. So I've teamed up with a roboticist at Harvey Mudd College, Chris Clark. We've got some grants from the National Science Foundation to develop shark tracking robots. Now, the cool thing about this technology is oceanographers have been using it for about a decade now to monitor the ocean conditions. So they have temperature sensors and light sensors and depth sensors and chlorophyll sensors. You can equip them with video cameras, and you can use that. So this thing is moving up and down through the water column, measuring all those things at very high resolution. But we can also trick them out so that they can listen and track a tagged shark. So I'm going to show you basically a robot that we bought, off-the-shelf robot, and then we tricked it out. So we put a pair of hydrophones on here. So remember, we have a shark with a tag on it. That transmitter is an acoustic beacon. That transmitter transmits, and that sound travels in 360 degrees from that transmitter. And the robot has two hydrophones that are measuring the time of arrival from the transmitter to which hydrophone it reaches first. So based on this, we could then program the robot to track a shark, to actually locate its position. In order to do that, the robot has to know where it is. So robots have Wi-Fi when they're at the surface. They have GPS, so they know where they are. They have something called Doppler velocity loggers, which help them measure their speed as they move across the bottom. It's actually high-resolution sonar. They have forward-facing sonar, so they don't bump into things. They've got depth sensors and altimeter sensors. They've got a propeller, and they've got yaw and pitch control, so they can move up and down. So it looks like basically a little torpedo. So in order to test this new technology that we developed, we decided to start trying it on leopard sharks, which we knew wouldn't move very far. So I'm going to show you an animation. It was actually the very first fully autonomous track of a leopard shark. So what you're going to see down here on the map are the little red dots are the robot's estimate of where the shark is. So what it does is it's using the time of arrival between the two hydrophones and then to estimate a bearing and a distance. And then the robot moves back and forth a couple times until it knows what side it's on. So the way we do that is we have the robot swim in circles. Now we can tell the robot never to get within 50 yards of a tagged shark. So what we're going to actually show you here is an animation. And you can see the robot going around in circles. The red dots are where the robot thinks the leopard shark position actually is. And somewhere in the mass of that red mass is the actual location. And you'll see a red tail, and that's the actual movement or path of the shark. So the robot's programmed to swim around in a circle while it's tracking the shark. But if the shark gets too close, the robot will move away. Or if the shark starts traveling away from the robot, so you can see it was a little curious of the robot there. As the shark starts moving away, you'll see that the robot will break off its circle pattern, start to track it, and when the shark stops moving again, it resumes its circle pattern. As long as it's in contact and it knows where the shark is, it will basically kind of surveil off to the side. So this is the very first time a robot has ever been used to autonomously track a shark. So we're now applying this technology to these little aggregations of white sharks that are along the beaches. So we'll get these aggregations, and they're literally just outside the wave break to maybe 500 yards offshore. So what we can do is go out and put out a bunch of acoustic receivers. And if these receivers are close enough together that when the shark's transmitter pings can be detected by 3 or more receivers, that same ping, we can use that to triangulate a position of where that shark is. So we can go out, tag a bunch of sharks, put out an array of receivers, and as the sharks are moving through here, we're actually getting positions of where their sharks are. In addition, we have our robot, and our robot will go out and mow the lawn. We can just have it go back and forth in this grid, and as it's doing that, it's moving up and down through the water column, measuring temperature, salinity, turbidity, pH, chlorophyll, its depth, so we can create a high-resolution map. At the same time, we're using aerial drones to fly transects over top, so we can count how many sharks we see, we can estimate how large those sharks are, and look at their proximity to the robot or to the other receivers. We can also use our smart tag that's on the shark to follow that shark around in really high resolution and see what that shark's doing. And then we can even take water samples to sample for white shark DNA. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So let me talk about our smart tags. Think of them like a Fitbit for sharks. So down here we have our little smart tag, and it's a backpack. It's designed to clamp on the shark's dorsal fin, like you see right here. It has a 3D accelerometer, a 3D gyroscope, and a 3D magnetometer. So it has a compass. It's recording those things 30 times a second. It's got a depth sensor and a temperature sensor. It's got an acoustic transmitter on it, so we can either follow it from a boat or our robot can follow it. And it's got a video logger. So this clamps on the dorsal fin and points down the nose of the shark. So we can basically see what the shark is seeing. So this gets put on the shark. It'll stay on for 24 hours. After 24 hours, it pops off, floats to the surface. We can pick it up and download it. So we tracked 3 baby white sharks off Belmont shores a couple years ago using this technology. And it was kind of weird. We got video back, and the video was at a 45-degree angle, and we couldn't really figure out why. After 20 minutes, it flipped the other direction, and we thought, well, maybe the camera was loose, it was rocking. But when we actually plotted the acceleration data, the tilt data, what we found was the shark was swimming in a 30-foot diameter circle in a bank, like a plane. And it would do that in 20 minutes in one direction, and then reverse and go in the opposite direction. In the same, you can see these circles are pretty much concentric circles. They drifted over space, they drifted over depth. By and large, to us, it looked like the shark wasn't going anywhere, when actually it was doing these circles. So my students were like, what is this behavior? 2 of the 3 sharks that we tracked did this. They did it for 4 hours. Well, it turns out that migratory birds that continuously fly will actually turn off half their brain and fly in a tight circle, then turn off the other half of their brain and fly in the other direction. By doing this, they're effectively sleeping while they fly. It's like autopilot. Dolphins and whales also do this. And we think this might be the first example of a white shark, a species that must continuously swim in order to breathe, actually sleeping. Now, if we didn't have this technology on these animals measuring at such high resolution, we would not have seen this. In addition, we do drone surveys. So not just underwater drones, we use aerial drones. So we're going out and doing surveys all along the coast. We can use that to look for sharks. We can also use it to count people and when are sharks in and amongst people. So to do this, we can use that video to see how sharks respond when surfers are around, jet skis, for example. The lifeguards would try to chase the sharks off the beach with the jet skis, and you can see they don't really care. In addition, by working with computer scientists, we can develop software that enables us to identify different species of sharks and track individuals like you see here. So this is an aggregation of leopard sharks, and we're using the drone to capture this video, and then using computer software, we can track individuals and ask, are some individuals hanging out together? Are they social? So by using this technology and coupling it with computer science, we can answer questions we couldn't answer before. So in addition, we use something called RUVs, remote underwater video systems. So think of these as GoPros on a stick. So we have a PVC pipe here, there's a weight there, and we have 2 GoPros. My grad students swim these outside the wave break, they stick them in the sand at about 10 feet of water. They point one GoPro towards the beach and the other one offshore, and then we turn them on and let them run. And interestingly, what we find is the sharks are curious of the cameras. They'll swim up and they'll take a selfie. So each white shark has unique facial features, white versus gray along their mouth, their gills, their tail, and they have unique scars on their body that we can use to identify individuals. So originally my undergrads were going through and building libraries by hand. Now we're working with computer programmers to develop facial recognition software for white sharks. So by using our selfie stations along the beaches, we can build libraries of these individuals and track them over time. So one of the other new technologies that many marine biologists are using is this concept of EDNA. All living organisms in the water shed cells, and when those cells break down, their DNA get into the water. Now, if you went out and you took a scoop of water, a pint of water, it's basically a DNA soup. You've got DNA of viruses and bacteria and invertebrates and fish and white sharks and people. And if you have the ability to screen through all that DNA soup, but look for just certain species pieces of DNA, then you might have the ability to determine whether a species has been present. So we did this a few years ago off Santa Barbara, where we had a bunch of tagged white sharks, and we were flying drone missions. We went out, we took some water samples, and we only detected white shark eDNA in the water at this location, but literally just a couple hundred yards downshore where we never saw white sharks, we measured no white shark DNA in the water. So this is really exciting because it means that literally we can take a cup of water and determine whether a white shark is present based on its DNA being there. But we don't know how long that DNA will last. We don't know how far away we can detect it, or even if we can estimate how many kilograms of shark are out there. So we have some experiments planned this summer where we hope to test this. And we can even use these autonomous surface vehicles, which have little water pumps on them. We can instrument them with little PCR machines, and we can actually sample water, program them to go out along the beach, sample water. They have cell phones in them, so they'll actually call us up and tell us what they're detecting. So this is the future of white shark monitoring in California. So the bottom line is, marine biology is not the same marine biology it was when I started. It's a very different field. It's far more. Shark science is definitely more than just your standard run-of-the-mill marine biology and oceanography. We use physics, we use chemistry, we use math all the time. Engineering. So many of the tools we've helped develop or work with engineers to develop. And now with all this technology, we get huge amounts of data, more data than most biologists have the computer experience to manage. So by working with computer scientists, we're learning to better program and manage data. So all students, all I can tell you out there is if you're interested in being a marine biologist, please, please take a computer programming course. You'll thank me later, because now dealing with all this data is going to be a big challenge for future marine biologists. And more importantly, even if you're interested in shark science and you're not interested in all these other aspects, maybe you're interested in education, because with all these sharks out there, there's a lot of education that needs to be gotten out to the public so people will know if they're safe in the water and why. So with that, thanks. Hopefully I can answer some of your questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. That was incredible. I learned a lot. And we had some good questions. You guys can still have the questions coming in on the chat, and we'll try to get to them all. So I guess we'll start with the first one we got from Laura. She asks, what is the common ancestor of sharks and rays?
Good question. So the common ancestor of sharks and rays, so they're the oldest known vertebrate, true vertebrate. So their closest known relatives are the hagfish, the lamprey. Those were pre-vertebrates. So those are the ones that are kind of the most primitive of the vertebrates. So that's where they came from. Sharks, that group, have been around for about 400 plus million years.
Okay, so the second question comes from Caitlin. She asks, in movies and media, sharks have always been portrayed as a horror trope, and many people are afraid of sharks because of movies like Jaws, Megalodon, or even Discovery Channel Shark Week. What do you think is the most misunderstood thing about sharks, and why are they a source of fear for many people?
Well, she's absolutely right. So it's the media's portrayal of sharks that quite often foster the fear. And what I think we're learning is that that attitude is changing, mainly because we're learning more about sharks and we're getting that information out to the public. Believe it or not, many shark populations have been overfished for 40 or 50 years and are just now starting to come back, so that people actually have a chance of seeing a shark when they go in the ocean. And when you go surfing and you see a baby white shark swim by and nothing happens, maybe you start thinking, well, maybe those movies were exaggerated. Maybe they're not as scary as they were made out to be. And what most people probably don't know is if you spent any appreciable amount of time in the water off Southern California, I can almost guarantee a white shark swam by you and you didn't even know it. So not to scare you, it's just they're there, it's their home, we're visitors, and they're not bothering people. So I think the more people learn about sharks, the more those things become like Sharknado. They're kind of fun and campy and they don't make any sense and nobody thinks that's real.
She also asks, because dolphins are capable of learning, are sharks as well?
Sure, they're not nearly as smart as dolphins. That part of their brain is actually pretty small, but sharks actually have a very large brain to body weight compared to many other vertebrates, including some mammals and some birds. But most of that brain is dedicated to sensory information, interpreting sensory information, like being able to detect odors in the water or hearing. So it's those parts of the brain that make them very good predators, finding food. Not deep thinkers, but they are quick learners. So for example, we know in places like Hawaii or places where commercial fishermen fish, that sharks can actually learn the sound of certain fishermen's boats. So they know when they're going to throw old bait away, and they'll hear their boat and they'll go directly to their boat. And when the fishermen change engines and they have a new engine, the sharks get confused. So we know that they can learn those things fairly quickly, and they can retain that information for long periods of time.
Wow. Okay, so this is kind of a two-pronged question. So Kevin asks why sharks prefer warm water, and kind of coupled with that, Lisa also asks, we know they're survivors, but with all the climate change issues, how does that impact sharks in general?
Really good questions. So let's start with the warm water one first. So the great thing about sharks is they're found in pretty much all ocean environments. The deep sea, they're found in estuaries, they're found in the tropics, they're found in temperate water, they're found in polar waters. They're found all over. Now there tend to be more in warmer water, more species and higher abundances, but not necessarily not found in other habitats. So in fact, the deep sea is kind of where we find new species all the time. I have a colleague, Dave Ebert, and he and his students are discovering new species of sharks all the time. So, and most of those are coming from deep sea or remote locations. So there are a lot of colder watered sharks out there. And the second question, remind me?
About how does climate change, how is all that affecting them?
Okay, so climate change is probably going to affect where sharks hang out. As oceans continue to warm, some species that don't like warm water are going to get pushed further towards the poles, towards cooler water, or pushed deeper. And the question there is, will there be sufficient food for them? So these are the things that we don't understand. What we are hopeful about is that sharks have been around for 400 million years. By and large, as a taxa, as a group, they've been very evolutionarily successful. And we think a lot of that has to do with the fact that their physiology is kind of unique compared to other species. They're diverse in terms of the habitats that they occupy, and most of them are very mobile.
Okay, so we got a couple more. Jace G asks, how many different species of sharks are there?
So that's a question that will get biologists arguing, right? So in the last 20 years, we've added probably about 100 new species of sharks to the list. Probably somewhere in the 400s, mid 400s. And like I said, I have colleagues that are discovering new species every year. So the deep sea is largely unexplored. We know less about the deep sea than we know about space. So there's probably a lot more sharks out there to be discovered. And what we don't know is, are some species going extinct faster than we can find them?
Okay, so a couple more. David asks, how often do sharks feed? And Lara asks, do they have social interactions?
Well, those are really good questions that, like I said in my presentation, that we're trying to figure out. And it hasn't been until recently that we've had some of the technology and tools to answer those questions. Most species of sharks are what we call ectotherms. Their bodies are the same temperature as the water they move through. And what that means is when the water's cold, their metabolisms are low. When the water's warm, their metabolisms go up. So just the water temperature alone is going to affect how much food they need. Now, most cold-bodied sharks that are the size of, say, a seventh grader, a seventh grader is burning about 2,500 calories a day, right? We have to eat 3 meals. Seventh graders are probably eating 4 or 5 meals a day, right? They're growing fast, high metabolism. The same size cold-bodied shark is only burning at probably about 250 calories a day. So they may only have to eat like maybe a couple small meals a day, or 1 small meal a day, or once every 3 or 4 days. So those animals have much, much lower costs. But then we have species like white sharks and mako sharks that are what we call endotherms. They can keep their bodies warmer than the water they swim through. And that means they burn more calories, but they can swim faster. That's how they can take down things like marine mammals that are very, very fast and agile, and are very intelligent and social. So those are rare in the shark world, but they do have higher costs. So those sharks may have to eat more often. Now, a big white shark that scavenges on a dead whale that's just eating these big chunks of blubber, a meal of 400 pounds of whale meat may last that white shark a month. It may not have to eat again for a month.
Okay, we're getting flooded with questions here. We'll try to get to them all. So Nico asked, can you go into a little bit more detail about the tech behind the net throwing drones? And on top of that, I also wanted to know, is it dangerous? You mentioned the jab technique to track them. Is that a dangerous technique because they're swimming right next to the sharks?
Well, these are babies, so they're about 5 feet long, 4.5, 5 feet long. All my students go through a lot of training. Any animal can be dangerous, right? And any animal that's scared can respond. So my students are trained to how to interpret that behavior, right? We don't use that very often. The water has to be really clear so we can see very well. So that mostly we do it from a boat or from the back of the jet ski. You don't even have to get in the water. But when the water's clear, we feel more comfortable doing that. Do not do that at home. And then the other question was
just
the
tech.
So,
yeah.
So we just use the drones to spot. So we use those to tell us where the shark is, and then we deploy the net from a boat or from a jet ski right in front of the shark. So then, I wish that we had drones that could drop nets. That's my next cool toy. But right now we have to lay those out, and we have to be very careful because the only thing we want to catch is that shark. We don't want to catch anything else. So we have to be very careful about when we deploy the net, where we deploy that, and it's never in the water for very long.
Okay, we'll do 1 or 2 more. Mark asks, he and his sons and his friends were out surfing in Hermosa Beach, and they had juvenile white sharks jumping out of the water just outside the surf line. Do you have any thoughts to why that would be happening?
Yeah, that's a big mystery. People don't know why they do it. So there are a bunch of theories. One is they might be chasing bait fish and launching at them. What's really interesting is usually when you see adults that breach, adult white sharks breaching at marine mammals, they breach like a dolphin, right? So they land on their belly or land face first. Usually when we see the young ones jump, they land on their backs or they land on their sides. So one of the other hypotheses that we have is that they may be doing that to dislodge parasites on their body. So one of the things that our cameras have seen, our shark selfie stations, is that these sharks will, if they have these little, what are called copepods, they're like little crustaceans that move around the skin, and they probably itch. So what the sharks do is they rub on the sand. They'll even rub on the selfie pole. So one of the other things we think they do is jump out of the water and land on their back to try to dislodge some of the parasites because they itch.
Hey, well, we have many more questions, but we're running out of time here. And I just wanted to thank Chris. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I learned more about sharks than I did from Sharknado. So, so thank you so much. And I just want to tell everyone that we're going to be having more of these through Alt to See, Project Blue at Home. It's a webinar series we've launched that we just hope to have more guests as good as Dr. Lowe to teach us about what's going on in the ocean and how the ocean can save the world. So be tuned for that. Follow us on all the social media platforms. And I wish we could just give you a big round of applause, Chris. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.
All right, guys. Thank you and stay tuned.